I'm an ENTP feels narrative. I have ENTP preferences almost sounds like I have ENTP stats.
Yeah. I have
Right.
the building blocks, the ingredient base that makes up an ENTP.
And so I can use that in a very flexible way. I don't have to follow any script. I don't have to do anything that's been prescribed. I just have to be smart and increasingly smart about how I use my stats.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So Antonia, this book right here that I'm holding in my hand, I bought this and forgot about it like probably 20 years ago, the mid-2000s. I think the published date is like around 2003 or something. It's called The Imagineering Way, and it's written by the Walt Disney Imagineering Group at the time in the early 2000s. And I bought it because it's like every chapter is just a couple pages. It's very short. And it's really, I forget the subtitle is, something around like being creative, the creative process or something. And so a lot of creative ideas. Well, as an ENFP, I read, well, you can kind of see, probably maybe 2/3 of the way through the book. And I didn't finish it. I stuck a bookmark in it, put it on my shelf, and then moved like 4 or 5 times. And then I picked it up the other day and I opened to the bookmark and I found a chapter, like the next chapter in line, resonated with me, gave me some ideas. I wanted to read a few of the passages out of this chapter and talk about some of them today because I think it's really interesting. But I think it's interesting the nature of being an ENFP, starting things, never finishing them, or they're kind of like happening. This is one of like 30 books that this is the case for. Do you have this in your life too?
Yeah, of course. I find it interesting that the bookmark, like whatever you read next has impacted you so much that you're going to now read it and we're going to use it as a launching pad for the podcast. So it's almost like serendipity,
right?
Or synchronicity rather.
Yeah.
That you bookmarked it exactly where you needed to 20 years ago in order for it to be relevant to the now version of you.
The other thing that happened over 20 years, well, actually just happened over the last 18 months probably, is I now have to have reading glasses. And I'm super like insecure about having to wear these on a show for the first time.
And self-conscious.
To be able to read. So I have to actually put reading glasses on now.
Yeah.
Because I'm an old man, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And that was weird how fast that happened. Holy crap. Like I was all of a sudden waking up in the morning going, my eyes are blurry. I'm not fully awake yet. And then like within a month, I had to go to the doctor to get eyeglasses. I mean, it just happened overnight almost. Yeah. Within a month period. I don't know if everybody ages this quickly, but I'm having a hard time contending with it.
Yep. Well, that's what happens when you...
Thanks for the support, Antonia.
Don't die young.
Sucks to be you, Joel. That's what happens for you there, buddy.
I'm older than you are.
I know. And you don't have to wear reading glasses.
No, but I've been wearing contacts or glasses since I was like 16 years old. So I'm used to glasses.
You don't have the ego death part. You had to do that a long time ago.
That's right. I have no ego around having perfect vision since I have literally never had it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm wearing my $1.50 glasses I got off Amazon. Yeah. So I can't speak for the design. Okay. Well, so this chapter, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's kind of fun that I actually don't know what you're about to read.
I think I've read it to you before and I said, this would be a great podcast. You're like, yeah, we should do that someday. That was like last week.
Okay, well, it's been long enough so that I don't remember what you're going to read.
Okay.
But I am excited that we're going to do a podcast kind of in the same vein that we used to do a long time ago. It feels like podcasts have become, I have to do so much research before every episode for the most part, or at least it's felt like that for a while. Yeah. That I'm like, oh yeah, we're back to where you just say a thing and then I just start talking about it. So I'm kind of...
You're ramping up for this?
Sort of ramping up for this extroverted intuition podcast.
So... This is a 3-page chapter called Designing Interactive Worlds. And there's a distinction that's drawn in this that I thought it gave me so many ideas. I thought it would be really interesting. One of the things that I'd like to look at it through the lens of personality type and draw some patterns and some things from this. And I don't know if we can do that today. We're gonna see if we can make this happen in real time. We haven't practiced this. We haven't done this yet. So we'll see how our exploration, extroverted intuitive works for us. And by the way, I'm a terrible reader out loud, so I'll do my best. I read so fast in my sight that I stumble over my words because my brain and my eyes outread my mouth. We'll see how I do. And if I don't know how to pronounce a word, I just
Make it up?
I make it up or I move on. I go blah, and I just
Is it better for me to correct the pronunciation, or is it better for me to just be quiet?
You can correct it if you want.
Okay.
Okay. This is all experimental. We're going to see how this goes. Marshall McLuhan once said that those who distinguish between entertainment and education don't know much about either. We don't learn math in a movie, but we do learn a ton about human nature, which is necessary if we're to live happy, successful lives. Understand that learning is a major part of art also helps explain the difference between stories and games. So that's the distinction I want to make today. This idea of the difference between a story or a narrative we tell and a game we play. And I think there's a lot that you can derive from this. Watching stories, we learn by example. Playing games, we learn by experience. The difference focuses itself around who controls the protagonist. In a story, it's the storyteller. In a game, it's the player. And it's this feature that trips up so many, quote, creatives. Most of us are trained in storytelling, not game making. In an attempt to control the flow of the game, we often resort to storytelling techniques that inadvertently remove control of the protagonist from the player, leaving the player confused about his or her role in the game and frustrated. It's also why all the interactive stories, quote unquote, seem to fail except for novelties, like the choose your own adventure books. They never really take on. Like even back in my teen years, there were like these video games where you could kind of choose your own adventure, like storybook video game type play. Never took on. So when I read this about the difference between stories and games, it's who's controlling the protagonist. That's very interesting. I could take that and pattern it to a bunch of stuff. For example, I look at my country as an example, the United States. It feels like it's set up as a game more than a narrative or a story, because the idea is that every single individual citizen gets to control the gameplay of their life. They don't have to follow some predetermined story or narrative for their life. They get to just determine how they're going to play the game. And because they're in control as the protagonist, that means this is a gameplay. Like that's how I would stretch it to say as like a governance system, for example. Contrast that maybe with like a religious paradigm that tells you, no, the governance system of your life is a story. Like you're God's child and you have to live this way. That's the governance system, right? It's more narrative focused. You have to live to a narrative. You have to play to this narrative rather than being free to play in the game. Any thoughts, by the way, so far?
Yeah.
I just don't want to read an entire thing without thinking or injecting some things. But if you have stuff to say, please jump in here.
Okay.
So the first rule of thumb in designing games is never take control away from the player. If you look at good games, you'll see that the rule is always obeyed. Once the game has started, the player remains in control until the game is over. The only exception is in some games where the control is removed at the ends of chapters, natural breaking points in the flow of the action, like the end of an inning in baseball or the level in a computer game. And this is also like cutscenes.
Yeah.
What's the one game I play? Uncharted.
Yeah.
It's very narrative. It's very linear. There's very limited things you can do in each scene or each sequence. Like it's not completely free for all. They do control the protagonist more than most gameplay does.
Yeah, it's not an endless. It's not like an Oblivion style game where you can just continue to explore. But for the most part, you have control over the elements of the game that that you're playing it for, which is all the skill stuff. So yeah, cutscenes would be the exception. Yeah.
Okay. So remember, this is from Imagineers, which is a portmanteau of imagination and engineering,
right?
That the Walt Disney Company uses for their division of design and engineering for all their different theme parks and things. And I love the creative thinking that goes into design. So I've always appreciated the writings from these guys. The second rule applies to the design process. Let the guest be your guides. They're talking about, designing parks for people. Forget the director as dictator with a vision, Hollywood movie making stuff. Though you do need a vision, guests are not game designers. You can't dictate to them how they're going to read your design. So if you go to a theme park, for example, they don't tell you what you have to do. They don't direct you onto a ride or something. You kind of get to go wherever you want. You get to decide. They have start times for things, but you as the player in that space get to do whatever you're going to do. The guests are going to act based upon their interpretation of what you've laid out in the design. And you will be constantly surprised at how they misinterpret your design intent. You generally want to only sketch the outline of the game and let the guests fill in the details on their own. Rather than telling a specific story, here you are building a general world to let guests fill in the specifics with their own story as they play. And you'll discover that unlike a story, the more flexible your world is, the more ways in which it can be interpreted, and the stronger the game will be. So immediately I start to think in terms of personality types and how we talk about personality types. When I say we, I don't mean just you and me, Antonia. I mean the world at large. And a lot of times I am baffled and confused by how much top-down control people have. They project a narrative. Oh, Joel, you're an ENFP. That means, and then they start to project almost like I'm a protagonist in their story about me. You're going to have these behaviors, these characteristics, this outcome. You're going to be attuned to these things, almost as if they're telling a story about how I'm going to be living my life.
Or alternatively, ENFPs are like this and this and this and this, and so you can't be an ENFP.
Exactly.
Right? Like as if type was, yeah, exactly, a narrative or a template, and you have to either fit it or you're not part of the story.
But what I love about personality type is it actually doesn't work like that. It's like a game. There's principles and building blocks, let's say cognitive functions of my personality as an ENFP. There's principles of the gameplay of life or whatever. And that can show up a lot differently than what is projected narratively. Now, narratives, I think, are more simple. They're more direct. They're easier to replicate and remember, because if I can just remember a quick story about what ENFP means, well, that's a lot easier than remembering the fact ENFP has 4 functions, and it really depends on the ENFP, to the context, the situation, the timeline. That's too complex. I can't remember or think about all of that to actually live my life and have all that in me. I can't think about it principle-based. I'm just going to think about it narrative-based. I think we do that with a lot of stuff in life, but of course we're personality hackers, so I'm applying this to personality types specifically. And it's this other question is your life a problem or challenge to be resolved and overcome? Or is your life a game to be optimized? And I think I take the philosophical approach that my life is not something to be solved for. I'm not trying to resolve my life. It's not like an unresolved problem. It is a game I'm playing, and it can be played all sorts of different ways. And it's limitless in a lot of, especially my inner space. We talked about that in recent episodes. So this concept of personality type for the building blocks and principles of the functions and type, I believe it gives us way more nuance and flexibility. Now, it requires us to master those principles, though, right? It requires us to understand them so we can see the nuance and the emergence of them in the, quote, gameplay of understanding personality types. So we work a lot with our personality profiler training students around this. We say, get away from the narratives, the stereotypes online. It's really hard to help determine someone's best fit profile, their personality type, when you have this really locked in single narrative or a few narratives about what that type is supposed to look like. And some are worse than others, some of those narratives and some of those types. But we do a lot of work on the functions, understand them, embody them, experience them, and then use them as a basis of understanding.
So I want to go back to a thing you said before. It almost sounded like a non sequitur, but I think it's actually probably the heart of what you're talking about, which is my life a problem to solve or a game to be optimized? And I think what I'm taking, or the connection I would make, since I don't think that you said it explicitly, is in a narrative, in any good story, there's a problem to solve.
Yeah.
Like in any narrative, like book or movie or whatever.
Usually it's a multi-layered problem, inner, outer, and philosophical.
Right. And it shows up, like it really shows up and kicks off the second act.
Yeah.
And the second act is like them resolving it, or the third act is them resolving it and getting back to whatever. And so if we think in terms of narrative, almost like we can't help but be influenced by how things have been presented to us our entire lives. And that's how narratives and stories are always presented to us. They're always presented as a problem to solve, because that's just the structure of a narrative, a story. That's what's compelling and gripping. So I think what I hear you say is, or what I'm hearing you say is that if you see life as a narrative, as a story that is being told to you, even if you're the protagonist, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have control over what happens. And inevitably, kicking off quote unquote act 2 or whatever, there's going to be a problem to solve. And so is your life a problem to solve? Are you living out a story that you are the protagonist, but not necessarily the narrator? And life is throwing you problems to solve, perhaps for somebody else's entertainment.
Yeah.
Or are you a game to be optimized, meaning that, no, actually, you are both the protagonist and you're in control. And this terrain is not following a linear script. It's more open source, and there's a bunch of different things that can be done. Your job is to master the game. Your job is to build skills and become better at the game. And so that feels like the premise of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And he goes on to talk a little bit about, talks about designing through play, tests. Yeah. Well, okay. So the third rule. So the second rule applies to the design process. Let the guest be your guide. The third rule is design through mock-ups and play tests. And again, in Personality Hacker, we hold loosely to type. Often, like in our profiler training, we tell people, try not to rush to find the best fit type. We're more in a playful space here. We're playing with the process of understanding.
Yeah.
We're role playing with it. Right. So the third rule, and again, he's talking again to designing theme parks, but the third rule is design through mock-ups and playtests. Each medium has its own specialized shorthand used to outline and develop a concept during its design. Films use storyboards, rides use models, games use mock-ups. Try to imagine trying to sell Tetris or Pac-Man with only a storyboard, right? You need the mock-up to see all the interactiveness. So again, sometimes narratives can limit us. We don't see all the dimensions of something. I think this happens in personality as well. Let's see. Mock-ups and playtests are the only way to confirm that the world you're inventing is truly an intriguing place to play in. And it's the tool to use to work through the myriad of blind alleys, areas of confusion, and so forth that every game must rid itself before the design is complete. So I think one of the things that I see in gameplay is it's like, if I take the perspective that life is not something to be resolved or overcome, the pressure is off. Okay, I'm testing some things. I'm experimenting with my world. Now, I am wired to want to do this. So are you, Antonia, based on our personality types. Other people are like, I want to know what to expect. I want to live to the expectation. I like to stay on the straight and narrow. I don't want to experiment a lot. I don't want to disrupt my life. I like it consistent. So I understand that I'm also speaking from my personhood here, or my personality in itself as well, and what I would desire.
But to that point, I think it makes a person a little vulnerable if they're looking for a narrative. Like, yeah. I mean, we're in the realm of philosophy right now. Is life a narrative, right? Is life a story or that is going to carry a problem to solve? Or is life a game to be optimized? That's an entirely philosophical question. And there's no answer for it.
Well, there's some utility to it, though, because there are people telling me the narrative of who I am and what it means to be me, or myself in society or something at this time.
Right. Well, and that was what I was going to say is, if you desire it to be something that's more predictable, something that is more of a narrative style, then you unconsciously look for somebody to be a narrator, right? You're looking for somebody to tell your story. You're looking for a story to fit into, and so you might even willingly hand over more power or an inappropriate amount of power to a compelling narrative. Does that make sense? It's like,
sure.
You're looking for something to give you order and predictability in your life.
Yes.
And paradigms or belief systems are narratives. And so you're looking for a narrative to plug into if that's your desire. And while you say, well, my personality type is more of a game to be optimized, and that's just my my personality type is looking for that. It's like, well, there are drawbacks to that. There's less predictability. You have to be a bit more process oriented. You have to be more skill developed or into skill development. And there's a lot more on your shoulders riding on you to be the person who shows up. But on the plus side, you don't have somebody telling you who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah. You have a lot more flexibility. You have a lot more like internal locus of control, basically.
Yeah, I think gameplay is more gameplay is more principled. And I think it is, well, I'll say this. I think narratives are bullies, and they want to be the only narrative. Let's think about the 1930s Germany. Nazism as a narrative wanted to win out and be the only narrative in the country. It did not want individuals to be able to play the game how they felt fit. It wanted everyone to come in alignment with that. The reason I use that is because I think that's one we could all agree is pretty terrible.
Yeah.
Most people I talk to are going to think that's a bad one, because right. I could find modern narratives where I think it's just as bullied. It's bullying us just as much as the Nazi narrative, but people like it more, and so they're not going to see it that way.
Yeah.
But I think most people would look at the 1930s Germany and go, okay, that's a narrative that was definitely a bully so much in its own country, and it swept all that up. It wanted more. Narratives want to gather as much power and bully you into their belief structure or the way to see it that way. Like, they're never satisfied. A narrative will never be sated. The story must go on and collect more and more proof that it's real and right, and it's the right story to be thinking or talking about.
Well, because its life cycle is based on contagiousness.
Yes.
Like, it has to be contagious. Otherwise, it dies. If people stop believing in it, it's no longer a narrative that's alive.
Sure.
So there's a like, it's looking for it. I don't know if they're all bullies. I actually think there's a ton of narratives and belief systems and paradigms that are not bullies, but they do want to be your one and only.
Sure.
Like, they don't necessarily,
okay,
club people over the head.
Maybe not bully, but yeah.
Yeah. But there's definitely, like, they're trying to live too.
Yes.
Right? And that's how they live. They live through contagiousness, either force or simply, like, there's some narratives that benefit from the fact that they are so pleasant and people want to believe them.
Yes.
And so that's how they go viral.
Yes. And I like, and again, I'm bringing more philosophy in here and I'm bouncing all over the place. So outside of type, I'll come back to type, but I love reading a principle-based material from like somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who helped found the country that I live in. At the time, people were under the influence of the Enlightenment and some principle-based thinking. And I think that what they said is, well, and some of them were deists, this great clockmaker in the sky kind of idea is what they believed. And I think they took that same thinking and they went, well, how do we think in terms of like a country and a governance system set up to where it's more like a game? We follow basic principles. We don't tell anyone what they have to do. We don't say there's one religion of the land. We don't even have an official language in the country I live in, because they figure, well, everybody gets to choose how they're going to be the protagonist in this story for themselves. Now, by the way, there's a bunch of stuff that it wasn't all principle based, a bunch of narratives that get in there. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't perfect. It's ever moving toward refining itself. But from a governance system, it was one of the few in the world that was set up in a principled way to use the principles to empower the individual to be able to play the game any way they saw fit.
Yeah, it's actually a thing of beauty.
I think it's brilliant.
If you start diving into the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation and all of the principles and all the thinking, it's actually quite elegant.
All right, and I want to put this in this last bit here, and then that we can riff even more, because I think this is important because it speaks to what I'm saying. Finally, remember that though it's not always true, stories tend to be proportionally more literal, while games are more symbolic. So that's the other concept I want to inject here, is there's principles and symbols in gameplay where stories are more literal, like that actually happened in the story. And we take, even if a story is an abstraction or it's made up, we take it more literally than games. Games, even though there's winners and losers and competition often in games, weirdly enough, we're less attached, even though there's competition. And in stories, even if there's not competition, we tend to get more attached.
Yeah, like
interesting.
When somebody loses, it's considered bad form to cry. When somebody in a story or character that you've gotten close to dies, then it's totally appropriate to cry.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do get a lot more attached to narratives.
Okay, so I want to keep going here. Finish this. Stories. This is also about stories versus games. Stories focus on human scale interactions and teach us about personal level things, while games tend to focus more on the structural aspects of the culture. Chess is about military strategy. Monopoly is about buying and selling. Baseball and computer games teach us the value of hard work, that there is honor in failure, and that if you keep trying, eventually you will win. And all of these are heavily symbolic. Football teaches us about territoriality. Oh, this is interesting. Primates mark their territory with feces. We are primates. It is no coincidence that a play in football, this is American football, obviously they're talking about, starts when a dung-shaped ball is passed between the legs of a player and that it's the position of that dung upon the field that determines the territory belonging to whom. So I think that I like this idea of the symbolic nature of gameplay too.
Yeah.
Whereas I always, and this is hard for me, by the way, as an ENFP, somebody that loves stories. I wanted to be a filmmaker when I was a kid. I love the idea of storytelling. Storytelling has been such a part of my life. And gameplay I've never been a gamer. Like, you're a huge gamer. And I've always kind of like dismissed video gaming and board games. I can play them, but there's a lot of people that are just really into gameplay, whether it's board games or video games. And I've just been like, I love stories more. I'd rather watch a movie or go see a play or something like that, or read a novel. But I have been waking up to this idea of, I think I've been cutting myself out from learning and movement, and there's some power and magic in gameplay. And when you introduced me a few years ago to role-playing games, I didn't grow up with Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that. Again, it was more narrative. You're also into role-playing games. And our Jonathan Harden, who's on the team, ENFJ Jonathan, he hosts these now. And so we played some with him, and we're bringing some of that into Personality Hacker. I'm awakened now more to this idea of games, the symbolic nature, principle-based, communicating, what did he say, truths or something around, what did he say? Monopoly. It's games focus more on the structural aspect of culture. So like chess is teaching us something, or football's lending itself. Football, as an example, American football is also not just about position and territory in a territorial way with the dung, on the field. It's also like a replacement of gladiator sport, which gladiator sport was a replacement of like actual sport of like challenging yourself and killing. So we have now a symbol of combat in American football. It provides the symbol of it for us. Mm-hmm. And we also have stories that can provide symbols for us. I can vicariously watch the movie The Gladiator and watch, battle and combat. But something about the game, football, I can participate in it symbolically. I can be part of that symbolically. And I think that's really important. So bringing it back around to type again, personality types, I think we're at this juncture right now talking about personality types. We've tried to make distinctions around, well, it's not just about learning theory, it's about applying it. Okay, yeah, I would agree. But what are we really saying there? We're saying play the game of personality. Like play the game of life with the principles, the chips of your gameplay, your character sheet, your min-max character sheet, or however you want to metaphor or analogize this. Play the game of type. Don't just have a narrative of type, an understanding where you passively watched a story about it, or you have a narrative in your head you project outward for it, like ENFPs are this way or INTJs are this way, right? Don't memify it, lock it into a meme, which is like a compressed story, like an element of a story in a way. Like live it, see its expression in real gameplay, in real life. Like go through it and bring it out into your real existence. But that is harder to do than tuning to narratives. Mm-hmm. You want somebody to remember something, sing them a song or tell them a story. Mm-hmm. You want them to actually make a change in their life, teach them a principle, and show them how to play a game. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what I'm trying to posit here. So what does this mean? And how do we think about this? We can talk about it for a few minutes. This is all I wanted to cover today, and just kind of open this up. And I want to hear from some people listening too. What do you think as you're listening and watching along?
So what did he say is, what's the lesson we learned from stories or narratives?
Oh, watching movies or watching stories, not just movies. Watching stories we learn by example.
Okay, so
and playing games we learn by experience.
Okay,
right. And this is again why, at like our profiler training, we do embodiment exercise with the functions. We don't just talk about them. You do something with them. We actually have exercises to express them, experience them, test them with each other, play around with the concepts.
I actually think there's value in both. I think there's value in, when it comes to type, in narrative. And you read that in narrative, we learn by example. And I think that's why people look for examples of successful people that share their best fit type preferences.
Celebrity typing,
or exactly.
Yeah.
They're looking for people who share their best fit type preferences so that they can, figure out what they did. They can learn by their example of gaining success in whatever area is important to the individual.
Yeah, it's like if that person could be successful, well, I'm the same type. So that means there's a bunch of availability to me too.
Right, exactly. But I think this idea of with gameplay learning through experience, I think that this is even more powerful because even if somebody shares your best fit type preferences, say in Myers-Briggs or some other system, they're still going to be a very different person than you. And that's their story, right? They're the protagonist in their story. And you can take some lessons from it, but it's not your story. Your story is going to be very, very different. Your circumstances are different. Your like everything but your best fit type is different from that individual.
Yeah.
So this idea of using gameplay to learn through experience, you could almost see like cognitive functions as your game pieces, or your type, and not as a profile, but like there's a modularity in type at a certain point where you realize, well, I'm not an ENTP. I have ENTP preferences, right? Like I'm an ENTP feels narrative. I have ENTP preferences almost sounds like I have ENTP stats.
Yeah, I have the building blocks, the ingredient base that makes up an ENTP.
Yes, and stats are more
flex and float all sorts of places.
Right, exactly. So like you were talking about in role-playing games, your stats on your character, like you don't want to over-identify with your character, but those stats are how you know how you're going to play the game.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you have a thief and you've got to go pick a lock, you're going to use your thief to go do that because it has the stats to be able to do that. But if you have, a tank character, you're not going to use your tank to pick a lock. You're going to use your tank to break down a door.
Yes.
So knowing I have ENTP preferences is more like I know what my stats are. My character, as the protagonist of my life, what my character stats are.
Yeah.
And so I can use that in a very flexible way. I don't have to follow any script. I don't have to do anything that's been prescribed. I just have to be smart and increasingly smart about how I use my stats.
Well, and it makes you smarter because you can pull the principles when you need them and configure them in the way that makes sense for the context. So like, I don't know martial arts, but I saw a video of this guy once. He was talking about the difference between learning like technique-based martial arts versus principle-based martial arts, meaning you learn how to do a certain kick or a certain punch or a certain move, defensive move, and you do it the same way, but you don't understand the principle of what you're doing. You just learn the process, step 1, step 2, step 3.
The wax on, wax off.
Exactly. And he said that he started to see better results in his martial arts training. Again, I don't know anything about martial arts. I don't exactly know how this works, but he said I started to look at the principles of what a kick meant. And then I realized that if I only train myself in the one type of kick narratively or topically or whatever, step 1 through Z, I don't have as much variability. I don't really know what I'm doing. It's like I don't have a principle-based approach. And his argument was when I learned the principles, the building blocks, I could actually learn much faster and with more depth because I understand what's going into it all. Mm-hmm. So I'll bring personality type into this as well. We talk about this with it's kind of a funny example at this point, but early on in the process, when someone joins our personality profiler training, you will say, when you ask the flow question, which is what we teach at the beginning of this process, you're going to get a lot of the same answers. But what do you love to do, right? And there's a whole process of the flow question, but it's gardening, playing with my kids,
reading,
cooking, reading, and sex. Those are like the top 5.
Yep.
Right. So you always will humorously take gardening out of that and go, okay, you don't say this, but basically you could say, if you're looking at type through a narrative lens, you say, oh, you like gardening. That must mean you have FJ preferences because we know FJs like gardening.
Right.
And we turn to the audience and the students, we go, wouldn't that be silly to have that kind of viewpoint? Yet that's how people show up to personality types. They have a narrative of, oh, you like this behavior. That means XYZ. Mm-hmm. When we say, actually, somebody could like gardening for a host of reasons. They could like gardening because they like the hands in the dirt. They like the beauty of the plants. They like to grow their own food. They like to nurture something and have something that they have to care for to encourage them every day. Like
they like to showcase their house.
Or, there's all sorts of reasons why someone might like gardening. And when we are stuck on a narrative, we're going to misapply reasons and behaviors to people. When we're stuck on the principles, seeing it like a game that's being played, we go, what would a character that does, like, we get down into the wiring of it, the principles of it, why they're doing that, what's going on there, all the ingredients that make that person them. And it isn't always somebody with FJ preferences, right? There's a bunch of every single personality type, all 16 of the personality types, and all 9 of the Enneagram types, and any other system likes gardening.
Well,
right? There's a person of all types that likes gardening, period.
Yeah, well, the reason why there's the top 5 is that's because they're associated with our most basic needs.
Yeah.
Like gardening, like that we've been hunting and gathering food for time immemorial, and then we went from that to agriculture. So gardening is very tied into our survival
for a long time.
And playing with my kids. Right, that's basic biosurvival stuff. Right, this is my progeny. They're passing on my genetic code, so of course I'm going to be interested in them. Reading is information consumption. Everybody likes to consume information. Now, not everybody likes to read books or like fiction books or nonfiction books, but everybody consumes information or at least enjoys it. So there are reasons why these are the top 5. It's not what they say; it's why they say what they say. And I think that modularity, like that understanding that this is a game. And we're all playing it. We might be, I mean, when you gather a group together in a role-playing game, there's usually a ragtag team, right, of adventurers. And they're all doing the same thing, or at least heading the same direction. But they all have different tasks. They all have different responsibilities in there. So are they all going and fighting a boss? Yes, they're all fighting a boss. How are they doing it? Well, this one's doing it with spells. This one's doing it with a big hammer. This one's doing it with sneak attacks. Like there's all different ways that they're going about it.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of a narrative, I mean, it doesn't necessarily preclude that concept, but looking at type through gamification and saying my life is a game to be optimized makes it so that I'm less likely to believe that there is a certain action I must take based on my type preferences. Like I don't feel hedged into anything. I don't feel boxed in, which is the number one accusation that people make against type, is that it boxes people in. And it's like, it only boxes you in if it's a narrative, right? If you have to be a certain thing based on your type preferences. But if it's a game, it's like, it doesn't box anybody in at all. It just tells you what your stats are. Like it gives you instruments and tools to start out with. And everybody starts out at level 1.
Yeah. I would also say that gameplay, thinking of the principles of game when we think about this, reduces suffering and trauma and difficulty. So I remember working at the zoo, which isn't a theme park, but it's like a theme park where we have to accommodate guests. And I was part of the signage department. And the woman who was in charge of the area, it was like the local American, like it was Maryland, like the Maryland area. They designed it and built it to be a linear experience, which most people, when they go to a place like a zoo or a theme park, they like to have the freedom. They like to be the protagonist in charge of the gameplay,
right?
And go to whatever attraction or ride they do. But the people that designed this thought it would be really good to force everyone to start at a certain place and then move through the sections in a linear fashion. But the problem was they didn't have just one entrance to this area. They had double entrances, and people were used to all the other places in the zoo just doing like going to see this animal and then jumping over this animal. And while there's paths that you walk through like linearly, directionally, you don't have to go one way. And so this path in this area was only one direction. All the doors were like, do not enter, do not go this direction. You can only go one way, but they're different entrances. And it caused, I remember how much confusion that the guests would have because they didn't understand. It wasn't clear that this was an anomaly in the entire, you can do anything you want except this way. You have to go this straight, narrow, like narrative fashion. They want you to follow a narrative. It was frustrating. Like moms with strollers didn't like it because they had to like park their stroller different places than they wanted to. They didn't like the fact that they had to like accommodate the fact that they're going through this linear. And then people would come through the exit into it going the wrong direction. And then the staff would get frustrated. All the staff that's working, they'd be like, no, you're not doing it right. You're not experiencing the right way. And it would be a frustration, a tension point, and cause suffering. And I take that to think, how many people in life are experiencing suffering because they're on a narrative track rather than a gameplay track? And I think in terms of young people, particularly millennials, who were told in grade school, 5th grade or whatever grade, listen, little Johnny, little Susie, someday we're counting on you. The narrative is you're going to grow up, be a hero, and save the world. Let's show you a ton of Marvel movies and a show on NBC television called Heroes. Let's show you the heroic view of the world. You have to be a hero. We're counting on you narratively to be a hero. We need you to step up. You're going to save us all. Mm-hmm. And then we get those same millennials, now grown up in their 20s and 30s, coming to our programs like Personality Life Path or Profiler Training. And they're saying, do I have to live that narrative? Am I allowed to play the game that makes sense to me based on how I'm wired and how I show up to the world? Or do I have to go through in a linear fashion and play this thing that's been put in front of me?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young people, and our age too, I'm sure some people our age got that message. But what's interesting about the Gen X generation is we were given a lot of gameplay principles. It was, as a generational cohort, we're nomadic. We take our tools with us. We're more about taking all these different components and then in the moment having to assemble something that works. And so I think, and we also grew up, the older ones of us grew up with the first arcades, like the first video games came on the scene when, your brother, who's just about 10 years older than us, he's the oldest of the Gen X generation, was playing arcade games with his free time.
He's mid.
Mid, okay.
Yeah, he's mid Gen X.
So he's mid Gen X, but older Gen X, Atari, or, in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, I think we started to see some computer games come online, Atari and all these out of arcades, and then Nintendo.
Space Invaders.
And so our generation grew up a lot on gameplay. Not as much on narrative as much gameplay. Yeah. Gameplay was it. And then it went back with the millennials back to narrative again.
Yeah.
And I think narrative caused suffering. I think narratives they cause more suffering than gameplay. That's the idea I want to posit today, is that as much as I love stories and narrative, and I see it weaponized in our world, like everybody tells us what it means to be fill in the blank, right? And there's all these memes and meaning making and signs and flags and hats and banners, and it's a war of meanings and narratives. And there's no fun in it. There's no playfulness in it. There's no room to play it how you see it. It's everybody's trying to jerk you onto this like big team of narrative back and forth.
Yeah.
And project on the other side that they're bad and wrong for the narrative they have. And I'm just like, I don't know if this is good. And I see it happening in personality types where we lock in, we nominalize things and we make them static instead of dynamic. And we have to spend so much time with students to say, stop doing it that way. You're going to your reads on other people in your profiling, for example, or your coaching isn't going to be very helpful because you don't have a good gameplay view of it. You're too locked into a single narrative or multiple narratives.
Yeah. So when you talked about Gen Xers being nomads and we take our tools with us, you're referring to generational theory.
Yeah.
That talks about Gen Xers being a archetypally nomadic generation.
We've recorded podcasts on this too. Go look them up. It's great.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about growing up and believing. So I was raised in a religion that very much, it didn't say that I was a hero, right? I wasn't going to save anything, but it was my job to always and perpetually be sharing content that was, like life-giving, right? Yeah. I'm supposed to be constantly sharing content through talks and through, approaching people to talk about, things that would improve their life according to the religion I grew up in. And I've thought many times, because every once in a while I'm like, why do I feel like it's my job to do this kind of work? Like, why do I feel like I have to take everything so seriously? Why do I have to record a personal development podcast and do personal development programs? Like, I look around and we had someone come to Profiler Training who was a comedy writer. And she gets people together and they write comedy sketches, and that's her profession.
She wanted to learn more about type because she wants to add it into her comedy writing.
Right, exactly. And I'm like, there was a moment where I'm like, how did you get permission to be a comedy writer? Because that sounds incredible. That sounds so fun. And because of the narrative that I was raised with, there's something inside of me that's like, no, you're not allowed. Other people are allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to go do something that's that fun. Like, you have to do something serious. Now, I have discovered my dharma, right? I've discovered the thing I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm glad I continued down this road. But my narrative, like there are some narratives that get stuck inside you and they're very difficult to let go of. You might not even think to question them for, until a moment like that happens well into my 40s. And I'm like, why do I have to take everything? I mean, I don't take things seriously, but I feel like my profession has to be serious. I don't take life seriously. I gamify everything except my vocation has to be serious. Well, why is that? Well, that's because I was imprinted on that from the time I was a tiny little kid. So what's interesting is I think, though, that as opposed to the specific narrative I was given, which is you have to do something serious and this is the serious thing that you're doing, I, at a certain point, went, yeah, that's not my life. That's not the thing I'm going to be doing. That narrative stuck with me, but I took it to a place that was a lot more interesting to me as an individual. I took it to type. Type had always been fascinating to me. I learned it when I was 14 and I never looked back. Like it was a bug. I got bitten by that bug. The wand chose me. And so I took all that narrative and I applied it to the thing I wanted to do. I applied it to the game I wanted to play. And this is the game I want to play. So there is, I think that on some level you can't completely get rid of the narrative.
I agree.
On some level, the narrative there's always going to, the millennials you're talking about at these live events, and they're like, and I kind of still want to save the world. And I'm like, that's fine. You can totally do that. I just want you to know you don't have to.
We'll do it in your way.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Don't do it the way you were told to.
But the gamification comes in like, well, and then I can gamify it, or I can turn it into an experience that I want to have. I can make it mine.
Yeah.
I can separate it out from almost like this foreboding narrator. Like I'm the protagonist, but somebody else is the narrator. And it's like, well, what if I'm the narrator, right? What if I'm both the narrator and the protagonist? What if I get to decide how the story goes? And then what if instead of it going a very specific way, what if I start to see it as a game, right? And I think it might sound like I'm contradicting you, but as you're talking, I'm going like, I don't know if people can just eschew narrative because it's so much a part of us.
No, I don't. I don't think we should throw it out. I'm making to love into an idea right now.
Yeah,
I'm like,
I understand.
this is a concept or idea. I don't think narrative is. Again, I love stories. I will probably still love stories. I like to write and create stories. I tell stories. Like I'm a storyteller. I like narrative.
Yeah,
don't get me wrong. But there is something about gameplay though.
But there's value in gameplay.
And I think I've devalued it too much.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing, like if you've overvalued one thing and undervalued another, then we tend to swap positions until we get to the middle. And I think that this idea of my life is a game to be optimized, I think that is a very powerful way of seeing it. I think it creates an internal locus of control.
Yeah.
I think it puts the power back in the self. If there are still narratives that we believe we have to, like I've brought this into conscious awareness. And I go, okay, well, I'm going to go do something, like my older brother, he writes fiction for a living. And I'm like, why does he get to play?
Very successful, by the way.
Right. But I'm like,
extremely successful.
Why does he get to do that? Why do I have to keep being serious? Like, how did he not have that narrative? And I'm like, well, actually, he was given very different narratives than I was, actually, weirdly enough. So I'm like, okay, well, he gets to go do that. And that's fun. And every once in a while, I'm like, okay, I'm abandoning everything, all serious things, and I'm just going to go do something frivolous. And then I go, I don't know. I think I'm okay with this narrative. I think I'm all right with it. And I like to apply my type preferences. I like to see them as stats. I like to see them as skills that I develop over time.
Yeah.
I like to see myself leveling up when it comes to the narrative piece. And I don't believe that I'm stuck in a story. I don't believe that it's a problem to solve.
Yeah.
It's my narrative that I get to watch emerge over time. And it emerges so much better when I see it as a game to optimize.
Yeah. Okay. So we have two friends in Southern Florida. They live in Miami. I was visiting them last year and they were talking about game theory and they take this to some radical extremes. I said, what do you mean? Like, how do you take this game theory idea? And my friend Chris was like, me and Daniel have decided we're never going to pay for parking ever again. I'm like, you're never going to pay for parking? I'm like, your car's going to get towed. They're like, that's part of the game. We're going to see. And that usually it's not a tow situation. If we're careful and vigilant, we do choose our parking spaces carefully so we know we'll get a ticket and not towed. So that is part of the game. But we figure that we can park, and by the time, like the one instance where we get caught and get a ticket, is going to ultimately be cheaper than paying for parking every time. And I'm like, that's brilliant. I never even, not to say that I would do that or we should do that as humans, but turning that into a game like that loosened the mind up.
Yeah.
I had a narrative that you could never park illegally, like without paying. I just have that as a narrative.
Right.
I didn't question it.
Yeah.
It was an assumption I moved through the world. And when they said that, I'm like, yeah, it immediately made me question my assumption of why do I always pay for parking? You know, somebody might be listening right now. Well, that's the right moral thing to do. Okay, whatever. Maybe it is. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that I don't believe it's necessarily directly harming anyone or hurting anyone to not pay for your parking. It's ultimately, you could play that game. And if you get caught, you have to pay the penalty of it. So they're kind of like stretching the limits. And they said the moment they have run the math, they've done this enough now for over a year or so, just a handful of tickets. And they're like, we saved, and they gave me the number. It's like an obscene amount of money from parking tickets or from parking fees because they just pay the fine. And the fine is less randomly than it would be if they paid every single time. Again, I'm not suggesting that we ruin society by not doing things that it's set up for. I'm just saying it's a thought exercise to think what else in our lives could we be thinking more like gameplay when we're so static and stuck in a certain way of thinking. And it really stretched me to think, I have the thought exercise now, like, okay, where else could I apply that same theory to my life? Just like the parking situation. What else could I loosen the tight grip of narrative on my mind or my heart?
What are all the many ways that, okay, take for example, applying it to type, I'm just going to take my type, for example, ENTP preferences. What are all the ways that extroverted intuition can show up for a person?
Yeah.
Right. What are all the ways it can? And if it's a token, if it's something to be optimized, you're not going to expect it to show up the same in every single person. What are all the what's the variety of ways it can show up? I think this is one of the reasons why subtypes has been so helpful.
Yeah.
Looking at, Dario's work with holistic and analytic functions, and then how they're, like how each type aligns with certain neurotransmitters and hormones and how that will flavor how the type shows up. But as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, so extroverted intuition married to introverted thinking and a dominant subtype. What are all the different ways it can show up just in that subtype? What's all the different ways it can show up just in the creative subtype, normalizing subtype, and harmonizing subtype? How many people have been harmonizing ENTPs that I didn't even notice because they're showing up very different than I'm expecting them to? Because I'm now a harmonizing subtype. I have been probably for the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
I wasn't before. And so it's a very different style of ENTP. In fact, it's such a different style of ENTP. I'm often accused of not having ENTP preferences.
Yeah.
Not by anybody who listens to the podcast, by the way. 100% of podcast listeners believe I have ENTP preferences. But if you don't listen to the podcast, it does not look obvious. And so how many people are difficult to tell? And how many people are conversations, like how many battles have been created over somebody's type?
Yeah.
When if you look at it through narrative, they're supposed to look a certain way.
Yeah. Or just really bad thinking. I mean, somebody made a comment once under our podcast that, well, you're both introverted sensing memory 3-year-old processes.
Inferior, right.
That means you don't have the capacity for intimacy.
Yeah, you guys don't have intimacy.
What do you explain yourself? What do you mean? Well, you have this function as your shared 3-year-old, so clearly that removes the ability for intimacy or something.
I'm like, where are you getting your information? I'm like, we're both humans.
That's somebody very locked into a narrative.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
They see a perspective that now everything has to fit to that narrative. They can't, if they were from a gameplay perspective, they would be able to see the differeces and nuances of how people show up.
As a narrative, I have to fit ENTP. I have to fit that.
Yes.
And having introverted sensing as an inferior function means a very specific thing in this narrative. And I'm fitting that narrative versus I'm a human being, and 100% of human beings have the capacity for intimacy unless there's something terribly wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like psychologically. And so those preferences, they serve me. I don't serve them. So it doesn't matter where my introverted sensing is. It doesn't matter what my best fit type is. I still have the capacity to have intimacy, and so do you.
Yes.
And so it's like, so now I'm using those as tokens. I'm using those as part of me. Yeah. They're not using me to fulfill their story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, as we start to land this plane, I don't think we necessarily have a direct point to make. We're pausing an idea. I'm playing with this idea. I'm not trying to throw away narrative. I think there's a value there, but I am definitely leaning more into this idea of game. Mm-hmm. We just gave a talk to the British Association of Psychological Type. They invited us on their most recent conference to give a talk. Mm-hmm. We've been on their association. We've spoken at the Australian Association of Type, the International Type Association, APTI. Soon, time of this recording, we're about ready to go out to Seattle for a live event very soon. And we're going to also be connecting with the people out at that association. So we've been speaking to these associations of psychological type often. So we're in front of the British Association a few weeks ago. And I remember us communicating with them. There's a shift happening in personality type. We're moving away from just talking about it and understanding it cerebrally. And I said, I see the movement forward as operational, meaning how do we think about type like a game or like something we operate or do, not just something we talk about or think or understand. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important to be thinking about. And that's why, for example, our personality profiler training, we organize the entire experience around doing a live person-to-person personality profiling session. We don't teach you how to watch a video and just determine or guess somebody's best fit type off of a video, because there's no feedback mechanism for that. And we draw that distinction. We've done that in podcasts in the past, typing versus profiling. Profiling is an active experience. It's connecting to another human. But I would also say it gets away from narratives. It moves us away from projection, because we're looking at the person in how they're like bottom up, how they're showing themselves to us, and we're identifying what they're showing. We're not trying to project a narrative or meaning onto them. We're trying to let that emerge in the conversation. And it's not always a direct science. I mean, there's an art to it. There's a conversation that's happening between two people.
Yeah.
And that dynamic conversation, I think it's like a little game you're playing with somebody. I mean, we're taking it very serious. When I say game, I think most people like, somebody might be just fun and silly and not important. I think games can be deeply important, deeply serious. I don't think they can have an element of fun too and still be serious.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a little bit of a gameplay. At our profile training live events, we often will do, Melissa Harris, our advanced profiling coach, will do something like, it's like speed dating, but for speed profiling, for fast, rapid engagement to try to break through narratives. Like everything I'm watching, if I think about it, most of what we do at profiler training and in that course and some of the other courses we do, we're trying to bust through the narratives of what people have to get them down to core principles of gameplay.
Yeah. Well, and if you have to do a live profiling session, then you have weight to it. Yeah. You have something that you're trying to accomplish. It's almost like a video game where at the end you have to, kill off the boss in order to get to the next level or whatever. It gives a specific challenge that puts enough weight on the material so that you actually absorb it and learn it much better.
Yeah, and it also helps bind people, because when you collectively play games together, again, I hate to call it a game. You understand what I'm saying when I say game?
Yeah, of course.
The principles that we covered here, right?
Yeah.
All the principles of gameplay.
It's learning through experience.
Yeah, I'm using it as shorthand for all the things we've covered on this show. And so when people play a game together, everybody has to do a profiling session that's going through the course. We have volunteers come on Zoom and everybody's got to do one. And so you're sharing this experience and y'all have to go through it together. And it's kind of like at the end, it's like we played a big game, a group game, and everyone overcame the boss in the game, right? The big challenge of the game, which is doing this. And what's crazy is you're kind of like collectively competing with the self. Like you're all doing this together, but really the competition is how good can I do for myself? Yep. And I want to get better next time, each time.
Yep.
And so there's no like winners or losers, even though it's a game. It's a beautiful experience. And I think and that's what we were trying to encourage when we spoke at BAPT, British Association of Psychological Type. If personality type is going to survive into the future, this new digital emergent world that's going to want to narratize everything and eat everything alive and put it all into AI and everything else, and we want to keep the humanity in it, I think stories are going to be important and narratives are going to be important. I think information can be coded in stories, and stories can live beyond the sensors. Let's say that, right? It's hard when information's coded into a narrative or a story. it can bypass the powers that be that want to control information. They don't know it's being passed, right? So it's subversive.
The sensors, CENSOR, not sensors of type.
Thank you for the
personality
clarity.
type sensors. Yeah.
The sensors of the world.
Yeah.
Yes, not S sensors, C sensors. You're right. Thank you for the clarity.
Yeah.
I forgot I'm using a word that sounds the same. What was I saying just then about
that? If it's going to survive all the narratives,
if it's going to survive the narratives and the sensors with a C, stories can be helpful to that, right? But operationally, stories aren't as useful. They're good for information, but not operation.
Learning by example versus experience.
Exactly. And when we're in the operation of something, the actual delivery, the gameplay of it, that is when things really start to come alive for us. And so I always liken it to tarot, right? And this is what I said on BAP's talk. No one goes to just study tarot cards for their own sake. Some people do, super enthusiasts do.
Right.
Unlike personality types, people just go to study it for its own sake.
Right.
When you look up information for a tarot card, you're typically in the middle of a reading. You're game playing the tarot card. You're actually doing something with it. And you get to a point where you don't know what to do. You have uncertainty or you need some information to help support what you're doing, like either a reading for yourself or someone else. And so then you go and you look up information to help you with the operation of this play that you're in the midst of.
Like the meaning of a card that you just pulled or whatever.
And I think that's where personality type gets electrified and comes alive, is when we're in the operation of it. That's why profiler training works so well. Again, the profiling session, I get to a point and I don't know how to do a transition between the interview and maybe verifying their best fit type or the explanation. I have to pause now. And I got to go figure out how I'm going to do that next time. I got to get better at the gameplay. The operation is making me understand the material more.
Right.
But if I can just sit back on in my room and watch a video and determine anything, well, how do I know if I'm getting better? How do I know if I'm calibrating? I'm in a narrative format, right? I'm just projecting my idea with no necessarily real world calibration outwardly.
There's no weight.
Yeah. And so I think that's why, again, I think that this idea of gameplay in the type community, where the information meets the operation, that's really the principle. I guess if there was a principle to all of this, it's that I would love for personality types, people that want to use it therapeutically, in a coaching format, in a helpful way. I mean, you could study it for its own sake, just like you can study tarot for its own sake. But at some point, tarot is designed to perform it or operate it with a reading. Personality types are designed to live them, have them change you, have them be part of your life, gamify it. And I think that is where I would hope we can try to direct the conversation as a community, as people that love personality types or people that have been impacted by personality types. Even if you're not a geek and you don't want to use it as a coach, maybe you've had a personal experience with it. And it was the moment of crisis or the moment of gameplay of your life or moment of change or moment of something that personality type helped you understand something about yourself. It probably wasn't just you read about it and were like, wow, this is interesting. I'll just pursue this. It probably helped you in some way understand yourself or others, understand your career path or relationships or your self-identity or worldview. Like it added to your life in some way at the moment you needed it. And so you started to like it. Well, don't forget that moment of the gameplay of your life. Now take that and see if you can keep replicating that in other ways, stretching your understanding. And then I would say this goes outside of type 2. Anything you want to learn, put it to principles and then put it into operation.
Yeah.
And I think at the operational level, we start to learn things in a much really rapidly, fundamentally, with depth. We were just joking that these podcasts are getting much longer. It's because we've been coaching with this material now more and more and more. And so we just have so much to share because we're operating with it.
Yeah.
In the early days of Personality Hacker, we did a lot less coaching.
Yeah.
So it was more theoretical and we could just go, oh, and that's how this works. That's how introvert intuitive works. These three, out, next thing. Now we're like, well, here's how it works. But also I have a client that actually had this expressed, but then actually this other client and the person I worked with here, and both of those are totally different than this other, we know too much because we've seen it expressed in so many different ways.
Yeah. When you get into the guts of it, there's so much variety. It's almost overwhelming. And when you talked about the game of, like type helped you when you had a moment of crisis, if you do see your life as a game to be optimized, type is one of the best ways to optimize it. It's one of the tools. So you can see type itself as a game, but really what it is it's an optimizer for your own game of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. What do you think? And what is coming up for you as you listen or watch along? Talking about this idea, some of the concepts are, again, narrative or story versus game. Narrative is exampled, like it shows us examples of things, whereas games show us experience of things, more principled experience of things. What do you think about this idea of operation, where the information comes at the moment of delivering something or operating something operationally, not just theoretically? And what's coming up for you? Maybe you resonate with these ideas. Maybe you completely reject them and disagree. You're like, no, narrative, Joel, that's the only way. I don't like this idea of gameplay. Or you're like, screw narrative. Why do you even give both weight? It's just gameplay. Or you are balanced in that. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. And I want to also mention that Personality Profiler Training, we've mentioned that multiple times on this program. It is one of the flagship programs of what we do here at Personality Hacker. And I think it is an incredible training. We've had close to 700 people go through it over the course of the last several years. And if enrollment is open at the time of you're listening to this, you should check it out. I think it would, if you're really into using personality type, whether it's as a coach, if you already are a therapist and want to weave it into your current practice. We have tons of therapists that come and take this because they use it in their practice. And often therapists will even recommend their clients come to us for some of this understanding. So if you're in the helping arts with anyone, if you help anyone in any way, this could add to your knowledge base of what you do. Or if you're looking to start a career around profiling and being into the personality type end of it as a coach or a profiler, professional personality profiler, I think this program would also be a really good fit for you.
Yeah, I agree. It's a fantastic program. And like you said, I can't believe it's been almost 700 people have gone through it.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Did I wear you out, Antonia? You seem a little tired. We've been recording a lot today, I know.
We have been recording a lot today, and I think this is the end of
This is our last one.
This is the last one. We pulled it through, though. We're about to go to, at the time of this recording, we're about to go to the live event for the last Profiler training course.
That's right.
The 5-day live event. So we're kind of pre-recording some of these. Yes, it's been a long day, but I'm here and I made it to the end. So
fair enough. That's all that matters, right?
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes or Spotify or whatever you're using, that
your platform of choice.
That helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And yes, go check out Profiler Training. I get more information at profilertraining.com. You'll get information about what's in the program. You'll see snippets of some of the things that we do, profiling sessions, some testimonials of people who've been through it before, and see if it's a program that is interesting to you. And is there anything else that they should do? But go to profilertraining.com.
That's pretty good. I think there should be guidance there. If not, we'll talk to our team about it. We should have guidance there.
I think you can. I think you can enter your name and get on the interest list to be notified of when the next Profiler Training course is opening up.
Yep. All right. So, gameplay or narrative? Think about it. Let us know. Join Profiler Training. We'll see you in that program. Hopefully, Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.